I'm delighted to welcome here this evening an old friend and collaborator of mine, John Henderson. I first knew John in Cambridge in the 90s, and we ran a Renaissance seminar together, which I have very fond memories of. John is now Professor of Italian Renaissance History in the Department of History, Classics and Archaeology at Birkbeck College in the University of London. And he's also a research professor at Monash University, which oddly enough makes him kind of local currently. He's based at the Centre for Medieval and Renaissance Studies at the Monash Centre in Prato, where, among other things, he's involved in organising what looks like a stunning conference in mid-December, the 14th of December. I thought I'd mention this because anyone coming to this lecture will surely be interested also in a conference on the theme of representing infirmity, diseased bodies in Renaissance and early modern Italy. It really looks a tremendous conference. So we're very honoured to have John here today, because he's a very distinguished historian. He's made an enormously valuable contribution in the fields of social history, religious history, and especially in his more recent work, History of Medicine. History of Medicine precisely in its intersection with social and religious, and increasingly also cultural history. His principal monographs to date are Piety and Charity in Late Medieval Florence, which was published for the first time by Oxford University Press in 1994, and in an Italian translation by Le Lettere in 1998. The Great Pox, the French disease in Renaissance Europe, which was a co-authored work published by Yale in 1997, and most recently, The Renaissance Hospital, Healing the Body and Healing the Soul, again with Yale in 2006, and that was translated into German in 2007, and it came out last year as well in Italian with Odoia in Bologna. John has also edited a number of important collections of essays, including Christianity and the Renaissance with Timothy Verdon in 1990, Poor Women and Children in the European Past with Richard Wall in 1994, The Impact of Hospitals in Europe, 1000 to 2000, People, Landscapes, Symbols with Peregrine Horden and Alessandro Pastore in 2006. And he also has a co-edited book coming out with Routledge next year with Lucas Engelman and Christos Linteris. Is that how you pronounce it? Linteris. On Plague and the City, coming out of a conference in Cambridge. John's talk today comes out of this same recent research focus on plague and its impact, particularly within Florence. He has a book on plague in early modern Florence, which is due to come out with Yale next year. And we're very grateful to him for sharing his research on this fascinating subject with us this evening. He'll be speaking again at the Monash Centre in December in Prato again, as in the keynote talk for the conference that I mentioned earlier, so there'll be a chance for you to catch a second instalment there. His talk there is on religion, medicine and art in the time of plague, Florence, 1630 to 1303. Before I leave you with John, I thought I'd just conclude on an anecdotal note. As well as being a historian, John is also part of history, part of a history very dear to us here at La Pietra. He's one of a select and dwindling group of people who can boast of knowing La Pietra in the Acton days. He was invited to tea by Sir Harold at an early stage in his scholarly career. So I think we should all make a point of interrogating him about that at the reception afterwards. So I won't give you the title because you have it here, but I'll just ask you all to welcome John Henderson.
Thank you, Virginia, very much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you to Bruce as well. It indeed is splendid to come back here. I was invited to take tea by Sir Harold Acton when I was a very junior research student, so it's delightful to see the house again in most extraordinary, pristine condition. So what I'm be talking about, as Virginia mentioned, is an aspect of the book that I'm completing at the moment on plague in early modern Florence. And I want to begin with a quotation from an extract from a sanitary survey which was conducted of the poorest parts of the city of Florence in August 1630, at the beginning of the outbreak of plague. On the 11th of August 1630, they visited the gentlemen of the court who were undertaking this survey, visited the quarter of Sant'Ambrogio, and this is a quotation from their survey. Between Villanuova and Borgo Pinti, in the courtyard of the house of Mona Caterina, widow of Jacopo, and Mona Pira di Zanobi, redo the straw palliaces because they stink. And it's necessary to burn the old ones because there's a great smell. There are 7 people to a room, and they do everything in the same courtyard to the left of the room of Mona Dianora, where there is a fetid bed which would create plague. Burn it and replace it. So this passage then reflects the concerns of contemporaries in 17th century Tuscany about the physical environment and how the way that people lived influenced their health. Here we have a description of a very cramped living conditions of one of the poorest parts of the city, with 7 people in one room, sleeping on filthy bedding and straw palliaces. Furthermore, the real fear was that because these conditions created a great stink and fetid air, that would create plague. Indeed, their fears was realized by mid-August of 1630, when an epidemic broke out in the city. Now, this survey was conducted of the whole city in order to identify and remedy any insanitary conditions which might create plague, and as you've seen, included mattresses, cesspits, drinking water supplies, and piles of fetid rubbish. While the government paid for the survey and to replace bedding materials, landlords and tenants were instructed to make the necessary repairs and clean up the environment. Sparked by the beginning of the epidemic, it should be stressed that these measures were hardly new. They sprang from the long tradition of medieval sanitary legislation and were part of the early modern interest and increased interest in the environment and its impact on the health and disease, which led to the multiplication of sanitary surveys and ultimately to the whole movement of medical topographies in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The Florentine survey was then among a number of preventive measures taken by the health authorities to prevent plague breaking out, both from an internal and external causes. While on the one hand it was believed that plague could be created locally by the emanation of corrupt vapours from polluted matter, on the other hand it was seen from experience that it could be imported from plague-stricken areas. Hence the interposition of cordons sanitaires, commercial isolation of whole infected states, the close control of the entry and exit of people through city gates, and the regulation of markets and the sale of food and drink, all directed by a special plague commission or health board, the Magistrato di Sanità, as well as one of the measures most typical of early modern Italy, that was the establishment of the large lazzaretti, or isolation hospitals. So these policies, together with a whole raft of proactive measures adopted once plague had broken out in the city, were all part and parcel of a war against plague, pollution, and poverty in the early modern city. Indeed, much of the discourse of the time about plague and poverty has rightly informed the historiography of plague in late medieval and early modern Europe. Epidemic diseases, and here we should also include the Great Pox or syphilis from the 1490s, together with population increase and periods of economic crises, have been taken to be the cause of increased intolerance of the poor. As is well known, new structures of poor relief were put into place, typified by increased distinctions between the worthy and the unworthy poor, and the banishing and the expulsion of beggars. Added to this, as seen above, was increased visual and olfactory sensitivity to the living conditions of the poor, based in part on the revival of neo-Hippocratic ideas about the link between disease and the environment. leading to efforts to address problems of urban pollution. The nexus between physical dirt, poverty, and disease thus came to be emphasized in legislation and medical treatises, and was linked in the minds of the elite to moral pollution as well. This then is the discourse which typified government reactions towards poverty and disease at the time, and was not unnaturally traditionally influenced the history of charity and poor relief. However, more recently, local studies of the mechanisms and practice of welfare have shown a much more nuanced system in action than would appear from legislation and statute alone. Added to this, recent studies of plague have painted a more sceptical picture of the efficacy of public health strategies, as in the work of Alessandro Pastori on Genoa, Rome, and Bologna, Sandra Cavallo on Turin, and Christy Wilson-Bowers on Seville. And most relevant to the present paper, the Giulia Calvi's excellent 1983 book on Florence, Histories of a Plague Year. Now, emphasis in these studies has been placed instead on the permeability of these structures, the flexibility in the way that regulations were enforced, and ultimately how in some cases they broke down under pressure. So in my talk today, I want to examine this theme in relation to one particular epidemic which lies at the centre of the book I'm completing, an histoire totale of plague in Florence in 1 year, 1630 to 33, which was the last fling of this epidemic disease to affect central and northern Italy. In the introductory part, I want to describe briefly medical theory and developing government policy. And on the surface, this was a story of oppositions, the rich and the poor, health, disease, cleanliness and filth. However, as I shall argue, as one looks beyond the rhetoric, one discovers greater compassion towards the poor, often couched in a glow of counter-Reformation piety and charity. But in the bulk of the paper, I want to look at the other side of the coin. In other words, the perspective of those at the lower end of society to see what were their reactions to living through a period of massive regulation through analysis of trial records of those who broke plague laws. These records enable one to provide a more nuanced, animated, and less passive view of the life of the lower sort than that presented by official accounts. Furthermore, they offer a less draconian view than that presented in normative records, and at the same time throw light on life at the level of the neighbourhood, street, and even family, reflecting the survival strategies adopted at a time of crisis. So plague arrived in Italy in November 1629 during the Italian phase of the 30 Years' War. It arrived on the tailcoats of first the French and then the imperial armies and gradually travelled south until it arrived in Tuscany. And if you look at the map, you can see the two black squares were the two areas where the plague first was introduced to Italy. It basically travelled south and it arrived in Tuscany in the summer of 1630. It wreaked havoc on the way. For example, two of the largest cities in the north, Milan and Venice, lost 46% and 33% of their respective populations of 130 and 140,000. Other smaller cities such as Padua and Verona suffered even more. They had mortality rates ranging between 59 and 61% of the resident population. By the time it reached central Italy in the spring of 1630, the epidemic had apparently become less severe. So only 25%, a quarter of the population of Bologna was killed. In late July, the first cases in Tuscany were recorded up the road from here in a small village called Trespiano, which is marked on the map. A settlement at that time of about 500 people living on the main road to Bologna. Brought, they said, by a certain pollaiolo, or chicken dealer, returning home from selling his chickens in the Bolognese. It wasn't long before the disease spread to the city itself. The epidemic gradually took hold, and the period of worst mortality was in the autumn, with a slow tailing off, as you can see, over the subsequent 7 months. During the whole period in which plague was in the city, between August 1630 and July of the following year, about 11% of the resident population of 75,000 people died. So 11% is still high, but relatively low compared with places in further north. Despite differences which they aired in a debate within the College of Physicians, and here's one of the gents involved in it, or an image of one, plague doctor, most medical experts agreed about what caused the immediate and readily observable effect of the epidemic, higher mortality among the poor, who suffered recently from a series of severe deaths when they'd been forced to consume food and drink of poor quality. This had led, according to one member of the College of Physicians, Dr. Antonio Righi, to the generation, quote, in the bodies of the poor, of a great mass of bad humours, which had led in them to an extraordinary putrefaction, which even from a long distance and even from any occasion has become plague. So clearly, this medical advice gave the authorities somebody and something to blame. And from this flowed a whole series of measures already adopted in periods of recent mortality. Insanitary conditions, as we've seen, in the more squalid parts of the city were believed to be the cause of plague, combined with the hardship suffered by the poor themselves. Despite the constant vigilance of the Health Board, the closing of the Tuscan state through the placing of mounted guards along the borders, the close regulation of everybody who attempted to enter the city, plague did break out in Florence. At this point, the government instituted another raft of regulations, the banning of public assemblies, the prohibition of the sale of cloth, which was believed to transmit plague, the quarantining of the sick in their houses or in isolation hospitals, and the burial of plague victims in special pits outside the city walls. Legislation introduced at the beginning of the epidemic laid down that the head of household had to report any suspicious death or sickness to the Health Board, who then sent their surgeon to identify if it was indeed plague. Once the sick or dead person had been removed from the house, it was locked up with all the inhabitants inside, and none were allowed to leave for 40 days. Any materials which had been in contact with the sick, such as clothes, bedclothes, were taken away to be disinfected or burnt. And here's a satirical image from plague in Rome in 1657, where you see this rather energetic profumatore throwing stuff out of a first-floor apartment where presumably plague had broken out, and then it's taken off in these carretti. In fact, this is, as you may know, is a series of remarkable prints which were produced at that time, showing different aspects of the fight against plague in Rome in that period, which was more severe than it was in Florence in the 30s. So at this point, a locksmith was then employed to put and I'm giving you these details because I think it's important for my story later on. A locksmith was employed to put a bar nailed in place across the door, and the Health Board officers made daily inspections of the locked houses to make sure that nobody had tried to enter or to leave. Further, neighbours were then encouraged to make secret denunciations of anybody transgressing any of these laws, and each one was paid 10 scudi for anybody who was successfully prosecuted. The final plank of plague policy in mid-January 1631 was the enforcement of a total quarantine of the city, with all residents having to remain within their houses for 40 days, with one adult male allowed out to buy food once a day. The Health Board, the sanitary, immediately then put into operation a highly efficient investigative system when a sick person was reported. The account of the first cases by the official historian Francesco Rondinelli, this rather grim-looking gentleman, who was appointed in 1635 to be the Grand Duke's librarian, in fact in reward apparently for writing his history, identified the names of the main actors and their actions, a familiar feature of other contemporary plague tracts. The first case, or the case of plague in Florence, was in Via del Garbo, which is number 1. I don't know if you can see it. Which is now, you probably know it better, with Via della Condotta. And in it, this plague broke out in, as Brunelli described it, quote, in a large old house inhabited by many tenants, among whom lived a poor widow with 4 children. The widow was, in fact, the victim of the episode because both she and 3 of her children became infected, as well as a neighbour, Signora Maddalena del Garbo, and her daughter and her servant. Then, because the inhabitants ignored the health board's instructions to stay inside, they were then taken off to the new Lazaretto of Messo Bonifacio, which is, this is Via del Garbo, now Via della Condotta, and this is the Messo Bonifacio, which, as you probably know, is a late 14th century hospital, which was converted into the Lazaretto in 1630. You may be more familiar with the image of it as the Questura today. Eventually, only 6 of the 37 inhabitants returned home alive, underlining the severity of the epidemic at this stage. The health board officers, however, didn't leave it there. They returned to find out how the widow and her family had become infected, as Brunelli recounts. When they went to investigate from whence the sickness came, they discovered that Sisto Amici, who had a cloth shop around the corner, had brought to his storehouse a lot of cloth, guess from where? Trespiano, and that one of the windows of his storeroom overlooked the courtyard belonging to this poor widow. Brunelli's detailed description of these initial episodes reflects the aim of the health board, to discover the cause of the sickness which affected the poor, so by taking appropriate measures to attempt to prevent its spread. As the official historian, Brunelli was also concerned to contrast the wisdom of the sanità with the willful ignorance of the poor, who by disobeying the commands of the magistrates led to their own death. But their actions was also endangered the rest of the population, especially threatening to their social betters, as in the case of Signora Maddalena del Garbo, whose palace stood in the road named after her family. Now, it should be emphasized then that all these measures to deal with the sick, the dead, and their contacts was based on fear. Fear that they would spread plague by moving around the city or by carrying possessions which might contain what they called the seeds of disease. If the health board survey with the provision of free mattresses, enforced repairs of wells and pozzi neri, as well as alms to the poor, represents the more charitable side of official policy, the other side reminds us of the contemporary early modern distinction between resident and restless and rootless poor. Thus, the health board decreed that all non-Florentine beggars should be banished from the city and locals housed in the recently established beggars' hospital, the Spedale dei Mendicanti. Furthermore, entry was forbidden to, quote, all beggars, rogues, and gypsies. So these then were the first measures, and the concentration on the blaming of the poor begins to explain why the idea of the lazzaretto or isolation hospital was popular among the governing classes, who clearly didn't end up there themselves. The main lazzaretto was established, the whole series were established around Florence, but the main one was established at San Miniato al Monte. Apart from being a substantial site, it also had the advantage that it was separated from the city by the walls surrounding the fortezza, built originally by Michelangelo and expanded under Cosimo I. All these policies together then implied a massive investment of time, manpower, and above all, finance, especially as over 10,000 people were sent to the main lazzaretti of the city during the plague when plague was in the city. That in itself represented something like 13% of the city's population. But this evening I want to concentrate less on official or medical rhetoric and more on the impact of all this plague legislation on the everyday life of inhabitants who remained in the city, not having either fled or been carted off to a lazzaretto. I'll seek, moreover, to provide a more nuanced picture of the identity of the poorer levels of society than that provided by contemporary descriptions and accounts of patrician classes. The questions I want to address today then were, how effectively was the law put into practice? How far were the draconian punishments outlined in the decrees, from imprisonment to the strappado and even death, actually enforced? And above all, what were the reactions of the population to these restrictions on their lives? And in order to explore these attitudes, I want to present the results of a preliminary analysis of some 560 court cases of prosecutions undertaken by the Special Court of the Health Board, which cover the period when plague was in the city, building on, and taking further, the discussion by Giulia Calvi. These lively and often raucous responses of those arrested and of the witnesses to events demonstrate that local inhabitants who lived in the city during the plague were not a passive mass who accepted all regulations. Living in a city in which the sanitary had power led to the infringement of numerous privileges and freedoms normally taken for granted. The question arises, though, is how far did self-interest, or indeed fear of death, lead Florentines to depart from the model of civic responsibility, which was stressed as essential by the Health Board's proclamations and underlined in sermons and archiepiscopal decrees? And the corollary of this is, how far was the threatened punishments actually put into effect? The specific reasons that people were brought to trial can be divided into 5 different categories, and I'll briefly give examples, bearing in mind that these many trials probably only represented a small proportion of the actual activity which took place in the period. In other words, they're only the people who were actually caught. Now, first then, the pattern of prosecutions over these 11 months. These cases were not evenly spaced over the year. They increased rapidly over the autumn from a low of 16 in September to 116 in November, from which point they gradually fell over the course of the following 8 months. Initially, they followed the pattern of mortality, which you remember was that. Though prosecutions, as you can see, continued at quite a high level in January and February, because these months saw the imposition of the 40-day quarantine of the city, when residents were shut up in their houses, and clearly people got so fed up being shut up that they risked being arrested. The second feature is the relationship between male and female prosecutions. Men predominated over women, with 78% of cases attributed to them. This is not a surprising result, since it follows a general pattern of criminal prosecutions in the past and present, reflecting the characteristics of Florentine male sociability and work patterns. But before examining the actual prosecutions in more detail, I want to discuss the type of punishments given to lawbreakers. Contemporary histories of the plague represent punishments as draconian. Indeed, according to the legislation passed at the beginning of the epidemic, anybody who left a locked-up house or admitted anybody by removing the bars on the front door was severely punished. The men were sent to Livorno to work on the state's galleys, while women were put into prison. However, as was common practice at the time, it was also possible to petition the Grand Duke to ask for him permission, grant a remission of the sentence on payment of 200 scudi. Now, after reading the somewhat severe character of the laws enacted at the beginning of the epidemic, it comes as something of a surprise that 77% of punishments were relatively mild, consisting of imprisonment with or without a fine. Humiliation was at the basis of other punishments, such as being flogged in a public space, which was hoped to act as a deterrent to others breaking plague regulations. A small number were condemned to ride backwards on an ass, with the crime written on a card around the individual's neck. More potentially life-threatening, were those sent to serve in lazzaretti. But even worse was the dreaded strappado, being hoisted up with a rope wrapped around the armpits and dropped to the ground and dislocating arms and shoulders. The number of times the person was dropped depended on the gravity of the crime. Only 12 or 2% were actually sent to serve on the galleys, which was actually later on commuted to banishment. The overall impression then was a relative lenient enforcement of the law. Indeed, Florence makes an interesting comparison with judicial measures taken by other cities during plague epidemics. In Rome, for example, in the 1650s, there was an exceptional rigorous system for punishment, leading to frequent torture and brutal public executions, while Genoa in the same years had a more moderate policy. It's been suggested that the differences stemmed from the greater strength of the state in Rome compared with Genoa, though this interpretation can't be applied to Florence. It's possible that the less severity in the Tuscan capital may have been linked to a much lower mortality rate compared with either Rome or Genoa, leading the authorities to adopt a more lenient and pragmatic policy. So let me now turn to look at in more detail at the specific cases of people prosecuted. And this is where it gets livelier. The major crimes associated with residents were with residents against people leaving or entering locked up houses, which somebody had been identified as having been sick or died of plague. These included what ostensibly sounded quite innocent cases, with the residents entering or leaving to visit and go and stay with relatives. More sinister, though equally understandable on a personal level, were those who'd been discovered hiding and not reporting the sick, or even those who died in their house from plague. There was also deliberate criminal activity involving forced entry, theft of possessions in locked-up houses. And other major offences include what I've characterised as crimes of sociability, meeting together in the street to play cards or having a drink or going to the pub. There were also crimes associated with work. People, mostly men, were discovered to have left locked up houses and gone to their workshop. This was a phenomenon associated particularly with the textile trade, which of course employed up to a third of the Florentine population, but was at the time regarded as particularly dangerous because cloth was regarded as being the medium through which plague was spread. The seeds of plague were supposed to be absorbed by the cloth and therefore spread it from place to place. However, even here there was some official ambiguity, since during the total quarantine of the city in January to March 1631, the Health Board did in fact allow some textile workers to go to work, as long as they didn't return home, in order to help overcome the poverty associated with unemployment, as many sectors of the economy had been affected by the epidemic. All this activity then reflects the desire of individuals, on the one hand, to attempt to continue to follow a normal way of life, even during the plague, on the other hand, to either protect or acquire possessions, and seems to have little to do with, on the one hand, a sense of civic responsibility, or even, and this is perhaps more curious, a fear of being infected through handling goods which had come into contact with those diagnosed with plague. So just to go through this rapidly, as we can see, the ones associated with the house, so breaking out of locked houses, breaking out of hiding the sick or forcing entry were really the major crime which people were accused. Sociability was also clearly a problem as well, and then you could see the other types of crime as well, but it's really breaking in and out of houses which is what caused the most concern to the authorities. So we'll now turn to examine in more detail the specific examples of the categories of why people were brought to trial, and as we'll see, these change their relative importance over time. So first of all, let's look at crimes associated with houses, breaking out of houses and so on. Entering or leaving a locked house with or without criminal intention represented about 39% of these 560-odd cases. Most were people leaving their houses when they'd been in sickness or death associated with plague, and then during the quarantine being caught and being in the street after curfew. Let me begin with a couple of cases of quite innocent people who were arrested because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thus, the widow, Sandra Di Matteo, was arrested on the 23rd of January because, as she said, in answer to her the judge, "I left the house as I heard the clack-clack of a hen, When I returned inside, I was arrested and taken off to prison. If this is an example of somebody who left a house when they shouldn't have done so, there were others who were in the street and conversing with people in locked-up houses. And here's an example of the trial on the 7th of October 1630 of Antonio di Francesco Trabalese. Last Wednesday, I was walking towards Porto alle Croce, and when I was close to the gate, a woman called Maria, who was locked up in the house by the sanità, called out of the window and asked me how I was. Come stai? I said to her, I was fine, sto bene, and while I was talking to her, the police officers came and took me to prison. When questioned, he declared that the window through which Mona Maria talked was on the ground floor. But it's okay, I was standing on the side of the street. So this is an example of a person, Mona Maria, who could potentially infect an acquaintance, since if she was sick, she would have breathed out infected air. However, evidently, since he was standing some distance away, this wasn't regarded as a risk, and you'll be pleased to know he was released after questioning. So in these two cases, then, the officers of the sanità were following the letter of the law. However, because they were perhaps being too enthusiastic, because after further investigation, the judge decided that neither Sandro Di Matteo nor Antonio Trabalese had done anything wrong. Even in principle, the officers' actions were correct, since leaving or talking from a locked-up house could potentially spread plague if the inhabitants were sick with plague. Activities more obviously criminal intent were those involving forced entry and theft from houses, and they accounted for some 12% of all trials. As in the case in January 1631 of Salvatore di Vincenzo Tortorelli, who was a baker at the Porte Vecchie, who, according to the charge sheet, had, quote, entered the house of Giovanni di Jacopo Dolci, who died of the contagion, together with all his children and mother. Salvatore was accused of taking objects, including anelli and a collana, from this locked-up house, which, to make matters worse, he gave to his prostitute. Then, during the trial, it was discovered, in fact, that Giovanni di Jacopo Dolci, who owned the house, was in fact his father-in-law. Therefore, our friend Salvatore claimed initially that they were just his family's possessions, suggesting that he had the consent from the family to remove the objects. And to prove the point, he said, "Posso giurare sopra la pietra sacra." However, once he was tortured, he recanted, and rather a different story came out, and he admitted that he'd indeed just been stealing without permission. Thus, here, in addition to the crime of theft, which he would have been prosecuted even in normal times, he risked becoming sick through absorbing the corrupt air of plague in the house where people had died recently, and into which he'd broken, and thus spreading the disease in the city through his potentially infected breath, by carrying with him the seeds of disease attached to both the goods he'd stolen and to his clothes. Now, in these cases, all these people had been discovered by the employees of the health board. But the following example also involved theft from a locked-up house, points to a different system for discovery and reporting of crimes at the neighbourhood level. Thus, it was recorded in the trial of two lads on the 3rd of November that they'd been denounced by an amico segreto, who on the 31st of October had reported that he'd seen two lads climbing a wall of an orchard of the palace of the Guadagni family. At the time, initially, they hadn't been recognized. However, they had been spied upon, both by a woman who was a neighbor and by the Guadagni's gardener. They were reported as having been tried to break into a house which had been locked up by the death of the old man. After this was reported to the health officers, an officer went to investigate. He was well prepared. He took a ladder with him and inspected the wall and discovered, quote, a hole had been made in the said wall where a foothold had been made to allow the lads to scale the wall. So this trial then speaks of the ties of local community, indeed the neighbourhood watch. This type of informal reporting is part of a wider phenomenon familiar from studies of witchcraft trials in the early modern period, for which it's been found that often cases of denunciation stemmed from local rivalries or dislikes or petty jealousies. While this may not have played an important part in this case, as in others prosecuted by the Health Board, it may have been rather linked to resentment of the incursion of outsiders. But it's also important to recognise that there were financial incentives to the reporting of petty theft, for people were encouraged to make secret denunciations of anybody transgressing any of these laws, for they were rewarded by being paid 10 scudi for anybody successfully prosecuted. So let me now move on to the next category of prosecution, which was hiding or not reporting sickness. Once again, there was a variety of reasons somebody might be arrested, from the potentially innocent to deliberate activities against the law. The first case involves Signor Antonio di Giovanbattista del Tovaglia, who was arrested in December. And this is what he replied in answer to the questions. Last night, Sandra, my servant, came down with a fever, and this morning I came to the sanità to bring the certificate of her sickness, as we're obliged to do by law. After I'd given in the certificate to the sanità, I went to Mass. And after Mass, and I'd taken a walk, I then returned home and found that the house had been locked up by the officers of the Health Board after lunch. So here then one can see the various stages in operation for reporting sickness, but also how even a more affluent person could fall foul of the law. Although Antonio di Giovanbattista had a listed excuse for his absence from the locked-up house, nevertheless, it was observed that because he'd come into contact with a sick person, he could, quote, have caused some mali di contagio by taking unnecessary walks through the streets. This was, after all, at a time when mortality was still very high and there was a heightened sensitivity to the potential for spreading plague. In contrast to what reads like a rather careless attitude towards the disease, there is the case of the fishmonger, Giovanni di Bruno Brunelli, who is accused of deliberately hiding disease through not declaring that somebody had died of the mal contagiosa in his house. He'd been arrested on the 4th of November, for he'd been seen to have been carrying, with the help of another man, furtively and at night, the body of his grandson who died of plague in Via delle Rote to his own house in Via San Zenobi. The reason he provided for his actions was so that people who lived in the house where the child had died wouldn't be locked up, which may have been a consideration for them, but inconsiderate for the rest of the city. However, he'd compounded his crime because, quote, the said Giovanni had gone on to mix with a number of people, and particularly in selling fish in the Mercato Vecchio, where he could infect the whole of Florence. Although no more details provided, presumably his motivation had been to support his own children, so that his son could continue to work, though clearly he hadn't thought through the implications of then infecting the rest of the city, if indeed this was a consideration. It's hardly surprising that individuals and families should attempt to continue working at a time when occupations were affected by plague regulation. And as we've seen, there was something like 21% of cases attributed to people breaking the law because they were working unlawfully. And here is an example of a woman who was arrested because she was attempting to sell second-hand clothes, which was obviously her normal way, or her husband's normal way of keeping bread and butter, sort of feeding themselves. This is the trial of Mona Antonia di Giovanni, who was arrested on the 16th of November 1630. The judge began by asking, "What is your occupation?" "I weave, I sew, sir. In fact, I do whatever I can to survive." "What were you doing yesterday evening?" "I was arrested yesterday evening, sir, on Piazza Strozzi, where I was carrying 2 shirts to sell because I didn't have anything to eat." "Who's in your family?" "I have 2 children, 1 male and 1 female, who are very small, and my husband, who was a second-hand clothes dealer, but now does nothing." So here we see the problems caused for families when specific economic activities were banned. We've seen that the Health Board feared corrupt vapours were spread through cloth, and although they sanctioned the continuance of the textile industry, they prohibited the sale of second-hand clothes during the epidemic, because of the likelihood it might have belonged to somebody who died from plague. This, however, deprived the household head of the livelihood and his family from the benefit of the major wage earner. hence the desperate efforts of the wife to sell shirts. I want to turn now, in the time which remains, to examine the way in which the people reacted to the period of the total quarantine, as reflected once again in court cases. It will remember that this meant that all residents had to remain shut up in their houses for 40 days, with one male member allowed to buy food once a day. In the case of the poorest, the government paid for the daily sustenance of 35,000 people. However, even during the quarantine, health board regulations of the city do not appear to have prevented a very considerable amount of social activity. In February, the three main categories of crimes, sociability, breaking into or out of locked houses, and working unlawfully, constitute 79% of all cases. Many broke health board regulations through sheer frustration, either as a result of financial hardship or being shut up in cramped apartments with their families or even alone, as in the case of Lucrezia di Francesco Bianchi, who was interviewed by the judge on the 22nd of January 1631, and this is what she replied in the trial. I live in Via del Campaccio in Ognissanti, and about a month ago I returned to the house of Lorenzo the miller in Via della Selvia in order not to remain alone in my house during the quarantine. I returned to Via del Campaccio, as I said, but because I didn't know anybody there and I didn't want to remain alone, I went to stay in this house of the miller's wife, who is my friend. Then the miller's wife is interviewed, and it emerged from that interview that there was more to the story because Lucrezia had no ordinary profession. She in fact worked as a prostitute and was registered in the Sanitas records as living in Via Campaccio. To cover herself, the miller's wife provides a very human story for why she'd allowed Lucrezia to live with her. Lucrezia has implored me many times to allow her to return, and anyhow, she's my friend. So this case then talks to the problems of solitude and boredom not normally recorded in official documents, the interruption of normal economic activities, the fear of moral pollution, and informal networks of sociability and affection between individuals, which prove stronger than the law. Indeed, this is a theme which is repeated over and over again in these records, which reflect the close proximity in which families lived and the bonds which bound members together to provide support to the sick and dying, even in the face of state regulation and fear of their own fate. There are examples of people climbing over roofs to visit friends, carousing together on balconies and rooftops to while away the time. In January 1631, three men, Matteo d'Andrea Zaccagnini, Giovanni di Niccolò Fogliari, and Giovanni Sarto, who had been arrested because, quote, each day they'd climbed over two roofs and the terrace belonging to Beto Judico, and with the said Salvestro and his sons had played cards all day. However, worse was to come. For on the 22nd of January, they broke down the bar across the entrance of the flat belonging to two prostitutes, Maria di Menico and Benedetta di Francesco, where they were all discovered together and taken to jail. When interviewed, the protagonist closed ranks. For example, Benedetta, when she was interviewed, replied to questioning as follows: I don't know how to play the guitar. I didn't hold the guitar on the roof, even though I was on the roof. And Matteo and the man called Giovanni were on their own roofs. On the roof of Beto Judico Ostia, I didn't see anybody at all. So in this case, then, these people were, interestingly enough, following the regulations of the health board, for as instructed, they were taking air on the roofs. However, by climbing over roofs, they were, of course, mixing together, which the quarantine had been imposed to prevent. Exacerbated still further when they break down the bar put up by the health board across the entrance to Benedetta and Maria's flat. The protagonists were therefore punished for leaving a locked-up house, but their occupations compounded their felony, for moral pollution was added to the corruption caused by plague. I want to end, though, with a case in which people were arrested because they were engaging in what the health board regarded as being particularly inappropriate behaviour. In other words, they were enjoying themselves at a serious time, in the middle of the night. They'd been unfortunate enough to have left open their door when the patrols of the Sanitar were walking along their street. However, it's significant that here, as in the other instances, once investigated, this was simply the tip of an immoral iceberg. and it takes place in Via San Gallo. And this is a report from the policeman. Captain Piero di Pontoassieve from the Guard of the Bargello, in reference to the evening of the 24th of the current month, I was with my troop and the corporal in Via di San Gallo at 3 hours of the night, and found in the house Donna Maria di Giovan Battista Fromempoli, Donna Francesca di Lorenzo, and Donna Laura di Stefano. They were in company with a priest, dressed in fancy dress, in maschera, with a guitar in his hand, who said they intended to go to the house of a neighbour. So the corporal gave orders to take their names, and they then left. Then, because of the events of that night, these women were arrested and taken to the secret prison, so they could be punished for having broken the orders of the health board. And Maria Giovanna Battista da Empoli, one of them, replied, I live in Via dell'Acqua behind Sandrina. They arrested me in the house belonging to my brother in Via San Gallo, behind the stables of the Signor Cardinale, about 10 days ago. How were you found in the house of your brother? Yesterday evening, the door was open, and in the house there was nobody else except for us, 3 sisters, and Domenico Fantini, our brother the priest. And in order to pass the time, we dressed up our brother in fancy dress, and made a joke of him among ourselves. And while he was mounted on the stairs, dressed up like that, the corporal passed by and heard us laughing. He came closer to the door and saw what was going on inside the house. So in this incident then, the group was unfortunate enough to have left their front door open, so that as the corporal of the guard passed along Via San Gallo, he was attracted by the jollity and then seen the priest dressed up in fancy dress outlined on the stairs. The women had obviously broken the law, having left their houses, something prohibited to them during the whole quarantine of the city. Maria, furthermore, had doubly sinned because she was ill with morbo and should instead have been taken to the lazzaretto rather than enjoying herself with her family in the middle of the night. It's significant, however, that the priest himself was not apparently arrested, even though he'd behaved indecorously and had left his front door open. So these extracts from trial records then point to a complex interaction between authority and residents. They raise the whole question about how far rules and regulations were really put into effect. But the picture of a confrontation of authority and subject is too black and white to reflect the complexity of social life and individual reactions to plague. Although by their very nature these records reflect the structures and aims of Italian judicial systems, trial records also reflect a more nuanced, animated, and less passive view of the life of the poorest sort than presented by official records. This was not simply a top-down process, for many accusations were made to the authorities by people of the same social background. This would suggest that awareness of the dangers of the spread of plague and infection was not, as official records often suggest, simply confined to the magistrates, but also widespread among the popolo, with many instances of neighbours reporting each other for breaking regulations. However, as we've learned from trials of witchcraft in early modern Europe, we should also bear in mind that motivation of these levelling accusations may very well have been mixed, from petty jealousies and animosities in local communities, and of course the promise of 10 scudi as a reward for reporting infractions of law. However, as we've seen, these records above all throw light on life at the level of the neighbourhood, street, and even family. Indeed, many of the so-called crimes reflected the survival strategies adopted at times of crisis by those at the lower end of society. Their aims were therefore principally to protect family and property, despite the potential risk of being arrested, or more grave, of dying when they came into contact with the sick or infected clothing. Thank you very much. Kept awake.
Questions?
Sure.
Yeah, should we have questions? That was fascinating material. I have one very little technical question. Could you give us a sense of how much the 10 scudi were, the reward?
Maybe somebody in the audience knows. I was going to look it up before I gave the talk. I'm afraid I don't know.
I mean, I'm not sure, but I think Galileo was making 1,000 something in a year. So, Well, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why he
Yes,
left
yes.
Padua to come back to Florence.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, how many days or weeks,
Yeah, I don't
stages
remember.
that might
Sure.
be for the kind of people that we're
Well,
looking at here.
They wouldn't have been. I think they wouldn't have been paid in scudi at all. They would have been paid in piccioli, and so 10 scudi probably represented something quite significant for the poor, close to their annual salary, maybe something like that.
Watch this space.
So as long as I have the microphone, I have a question. Are these provisions of this year, 1630 to 31, unusual or characteristic of strategies that had already been used during previous outbreaks of the plague? Or do they represent a kind of new and more scientific approach to trying to contain the contagion?
Oh no, they've been developed in a sense from a long tradition of plague measures which go right back to the 15th century, which gradually became more sophisticated and more sort of better worked out. Florence, interestingly enough, had not had plague for 100 years. The last episode was in the 1520s, so there was this enormous gap. That didn't mean to say they didn't know what to do elsewhere, because clearly plague continued to be breaking out in the whole of Italy throughout the 16th century, and particularly the 1570s, which was particularly severe. But I mean, the whole panoply of plague measures was essentially grew up over the 15th century with the establishment of lazzareti, the establishment of the health board, the sanità, the burial of people in plague pits and so on, and the inspection and the shutting up and inspection of people in their houses. Already by the 1520, I mean, I've looked at the 1520s too, the 100 years before. Already by then, the systems were incredibly sophisticated. One of the institutions which was most closely involved in the inspection and the carrying of people off to the lazzareti or the plague pits was the Misericordia, and the archive still has a lot of the records of those people who were carted off, lists of people who were carted off in the 1520s. So it's an identical system that had been in operation for a long time, actually. I think probably what got more sophisticated ultimately over the 15th, 16th century at least, was the sort of massive communication between health boards across Italy and indeed across Europe. So we've, all the archives of all these health boards in different places in Italy and different parts of Europe contain the correspondence, or a lot of the correspondence. So you get, they were, sort of incredibly intent on finding out where it was, what it was, and it wasn't just plague, but it was other types of epidemic disease too. And so one of the perhaps slightly different characteristics of Florence is because it hadn't had plague for 100 years, it had no purpose-built lazzaretto. So they adopted, as I showed, San Miniato, the Badia Fiesole, and other buildings, sort of ecclesiastical buildings, and also villas as lazzareti or quarantine centres. Whereas places like Venice, Milan, and Genoa, and Livorno, for that matter, built their own purpose-built lazzareti, which then, particularly for port cities, were used for quarantining goods which came from abroad or from plague-infected areas.
If I may, so the last outbreak of plague before this was 1530, the end of the Siege of Florence.
Exactly, yes.
So this was the first time that any Grand Ducal government had to deal with this. They had no prototype for how to do this under Grand Ducal administration. It came from the Republic, from the end of the Republic.
Yes, I mean, well, I think one needs to put plague in context. So, for example, there was a very severe epidemic of typhus in Florence in the early 1620s. And a lot of the provisions which were, for example, sanitary surveys and so on, and the inspection of houses and so on, was put into place then. And that in itself was actually based on sanitary surveys which had been established in the late 16th century in many parts of Tuscany, once again, within Grand Ducal Tuscany. But, powers within Italy, within Europe, as I said, were in constant communication with each other and asked for copies of regulations to be sent to them. They were printed. One interesting example in England at this period, where England was somewhat more behindhand in plague regulations than Italy was, being a sort of backward nation until a bit later, not as sophisticated as Italy. And therefore, their provisions were much more primitive. And it's interestingly enough, in the 1570s, in fact, the physician, the Cesare del Mare, who was the physician to the Queen, was requested by the Privy Council to provide a copy of plague regulations from Padua, which he copied out and did, and they actually remain, you can see them still in England. So there was an enormous circulation of ideas. So in a sense, even though Florence and the Grand Duke hadn't actually had plague for 100 years, or it hadn't been in the city for 100 years, they knew very well from other examples what was happening and from their ambassadors and so on.
Really fascinating. What a terrible, fearful time to be living. I've got a couple of questions, and I'll just stick them all together. Was this the worst epidemic of the plague in Florence, of all of the times that the plague came to Florence? I'm assuming the one that you've shared with us it was the worst. And I assume that the reason that people hid plague victims in their houses was because they were terrified of being locked up, as you called it. And I'm wondering to what extent people denounced their neighbors, who were hiding victims. And then finally, we've studied and been told through research that the plague was spread by rats and fleas. What led them to believe that was in the seeds of plague were in the fabric of the clothing?
Now, this was actually the mildest epidemic which had hit Florence. It's only had 11% of the population, which was very low compared with, other places and other times. The famous Black Death, in 1348, it's debated exactly how many people died, but it was anything between a third and a half of the population. And then the population was larger than it was in the 17th century, with about 110,000. And then from plague, then basically returned every 10 to 15 years, and late 14th century continued to return in the 15th century too. The 1520s was actually much, much more severe than the 1630 epidemic. And it was much more severe, as I've shown in Rome and Milan and Genoa in the 1650s as well. So, and I think that's what, I think, I keep asking myself, and people ask me too, is why were these punishments relatively mild? And I got no real answer to that because the contemporary don't really talk about it because they represent them. The literate classes represent them being very punitive, whereas in fact in action they weren't. But I think it may be down to the fact that it was quite a mild epidemic, and therefore in a sense they didn't have to be quite as dramatic in the measures that they took as during the more severe epidemics. Then yes, there's this whole debate about what was the disease, which has been exercising historians and anthropologists and biologists and so on over the last 20 years. And as you probably know, there's a well-known historian called Samuel Cohen who challenged the paradigm. Graham Twigg was another person who did the same thing for London in England in the medieval period, suggesting that it wasn't actually bubonic plague. In other words, up till now, the medical historians and public health historians had associated all the plague epidemics in the past as being those which caused by bubonic plague, as identified in the post-laboratory revolution in the 1890s and early 1900s in Hong Kong and Bombay and so on, the discovery by Yersinia and so on of the plague, as caused by infected fleas jumping onto rats and so on. So what Sam did in his, first of all, an article in the American Historical Review and then in a major book on the Black Death, was essentially compared the seasonal pattern of bubonic plague in inverted commas during the Black Death with the pattern, the seasonality and the sort of gender distribution and the age characters of the people who died with those people who died during the third pandemic in the late 19th, early 20th century. And he showed that the patterns were actually were rather different. So this began a whole debate, which has been fascinating. Traditional historians have said, "Oh, this is absolute rubbish," and just discounted it completely. But I think I think it's very healthy to question these later assumptions about what diseases were in the past. I mean, rather than retrospective diagnosis, to try and understand, which is what I try and do, what the disease was at the time, and therefore what they thought caused it. And that way you can understand why they take certain measures, like shutting up people and so on. Anyhow, more recently, there's been a reaction, or further, the field has sort of moved further on. So a series of teams across Europe, made up of archaeologists and anthropologists and biologists, are doing analysis of the DNA of plague victims, and particularly the tooth pulp contained in the teeth of plague victims from plague pits in different parts of Europe. And they've identified the signature of Yersinia pestis from the Black Death and from subsequent epidemics. So you'd think that that would close the debate, but in fact the debate does actually continue, which I think it's a very healthy and it's a very interesting debate, and I'm sure it'll just go on and on and on. I mean, one of the responses to that is, okay, so if it was bubonic plague in the Black Death, how was it then spread so rapidly across the whole of Europe? Because it arrives in Messina in late autumn 1347. It's in Florence by the spring 1348. It goes to France, it goes to England by sort of 1349-50. It's in England, goes to Scandinavia, and so on. How does it transmit itself so rapidly? So, therefore, people started talking about pneumonic plague spread by people sneezing and so on. But I think what is interesting, I think that, as I say, the debate's not over, and I think I find, students always find it fascinating, so it's always something that I debate, and I get students to take different sides and to think about it. But I think the important thing I felt to take away from it all is not to judge them, contemporaries in this period, by our standards. Traditionally people have said, oh, well, they're idiots because they didn't understand what the plague was, which I think is completely wrong.
Thank you, sir. I have a little strange question. Is that Camus described in his book Plague that when the plague comes, people will pretend to live on their normal life, even though the law totally changed their life. But they will pretend to have this conflict emotion in their heart. So I just want to ask, is this phenomenon real happened in history, or this is just a literature plot? I mean, people's conflicts inside their heart, this kind of confliction, this kind of emotion, is that really happen? Is there any record about that?
You mean, did contemporaries record people's emotional reactions?
Yeah.
I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think some of these court cases that I've presented do reflect, the emotions of people, what it was like to have people, members of your family taken off to the isolation hospitals, the fear that generated being shut up in the houses. And I think one of the extraordinary things I haven't read this type of record before, but the fear of loneliness. I mean, loneliness is a very intangible thing, and it's very rarely recorded in official records. So I think the emotions are very, very real. I mean, certainly there are literary records, literary descriptions. People like, obviously, Manzoni wrote about it much later, or Defoe, again, writing about it later, or Camus. All these literary descriptions, which I think do justice to what it was like living through the plague as well. And for example, there's the well-known, fascinating chapter in Manzoni's Promessi Sposi about the Lazzaretto and what it was like to visit a Lazzaretto. And it was an enormous, great space which was used not just the sort of purpose-built houses, but also a lot sort of basically created a sort of camp inside this enormous area. And he, I think, does generate a very good picture of what it was like. And okay, it's literary description, but I think one can believe to a certain degree. And I think that is what is amazing about these court records. They really do. Of course, court records are problematic. One can't just read them literally, but I think they still, taking all that into account, I think one can get a very good idea reading back into what it was like to live through an epidemic, or indeed reading, epidemic. Just think as well of recent epidemics of AIDS or chicken flu or whatever, avian flu or whatever it might have been. I think there are similar reactions. We haven't changed that much in our sort of basic reactions to crises and to personal threat, and also sort of recreated in films like Contagion and so on.
With the meningitis epidemic that's been epidemic is a big word because there's not been that many cases, but the museum where I work at, many schools last year canceled that were outside of Tuscany because the parents would not allow the children to come to Tuscany due to the meningitis cases that have been reported, out of fear that their children would get meningitis by coming to Florence for an educational week. So some of these, those fears are still around today about whether to get vaccinated, whether not to get vaccinated, whether to travel even within the region or from outside of the region.
I was wondering about the financial aspect, because some of those people were one quite frequent infraction of the rules was sneaking out to work, wasn't it, particularly in the textile industry. And if large numbers of the populace are being quarantined and not allowed to leave the house, and these are quite, poor people living on the breadline, I mean, it's almost surprising there wasn't more kind of rebellion. These people must have been in severe kind of financial distress. I mean, were there funds made available?
There certainly were. I mean, everybody was shut up in their house during the total quarantine of the city. But then they were they were provided with food on a daily basis.
Oh, so there were kind of food.
Food was provided and paid for by the Grand Duke. And then actually, there are always exceptions to all these rules, so that anybody who, at the beginning of the quarantine, who worked in a workshop, even if it was a textile workshop, was allowed to go to the workshop and work, but he wasn't allowed to return home. Then during the course of the epidemic, people did continue working, so they weren't deprived of their livelihood. But clearly, if you dealt with second-hand clothes, that was a real problem. Yeah. But, I mean, the financial side is fascinating. I mean, the expense of these enormous, these measures that were taken was absolutely enormous, and all funded by the government and largely also by the Grand Duke himself, who, as you know, had just sort of taken over the reins of government, was young and was keen to impress himself as part of the sort of long tradition of Medicean generosity and charity. And it did him a lot of good in the public's eye. No, it makes a fascinating story, and maybe it's because the plague wasn't so bad, but the Grand Duke and the court stayed, not in Florence, but sort of went up to Bello Sguardo and sat up there, sort of above the miasma. And and relatively few members of the court, or indeed the patriciate, left Florence, which is very surprising because, again, it's against all the sort of normal motivation of people of the more affluent class. Although they were told, the decrees were passed and said, if you want to go off to your villa, you can. So clearly some did, but Brunelli suggests that not many did. And then the Grand Ducal Court assigned jobs to a lot of the members of the gentiluomini, of the senators. And it was they who went round and took the surveys of the sanitary conditions, they who went round and made descriptions of the poverty, and were totally shocked in this survey. Said, appalling condition, never seen anything like it in my life. Clearly they hadn't really ever gone into the poor parts of the city. And so therefore they were involved in the fight against plague, and the people who ran the sanità, the magistrati sanità, were also part of the patrician class. It was curious. There's a fascinating diary which was kept in this period by Giovanni Baldinucci. I don't know if you know it, but it was recently published by Brendan Dooley, and he stayed in his palace in Via de Ginori and describes on a daily basis almost of what it was like to live through plague, and the emotions for you were there, and how terrible it was. So it was very different from some of the other epidemics which people have studied. Yes.
I was very much intrigued by the ongoing social life during the plague times, and I like very much the last case you presented about the three sisters. This case opposed to the continuing denouncing and also maybe the financial interest of people denouncing other neighbors. Was this case of the three sisters that kind of naively just stated, well, yeah, we just went out to see our brother and we just came together there, even though they must have been perfectly aware of the fact that they're in quarantine living. Yes. And I was wondering if you found more cases that stated this ongoing social life, and also neighbors or witnesses in the community as people that somehow ignored the fact of the plague, and in a naively way stated that social life was just a common feature of these years.
I think before the quarantine was imposed, there was a lot of social life. There was probably a bit less social activity during the quarantine itself, the total quarantine of the city. But I mean, from the cases which survived for the quarantine, even then, there seems to have been lots of activity. Yes, I mean these. I don't know how typical the three sisters and their brother were, but and obviously, clearly a lot of people did go around visiting each other, and the fact that one male member of the household was allowed out every day, there's no guarantee that he actually went home immediately. I mean, he bought his food and then he probably went round to visit friends, and people were accused of gathering in cafes and bars and playing games and enjoying themselves as they weren't supposed to. Yes. So, I mean, it's difficult to know, how much activity there was, because clearly court cases are only those people who were actually caught. So therefore, there was probably a lot more than was indicated even in the court cases. So I think that the way that clearly the law was enforced, but there must have been a certain amount of flexibility in it as well.
Was there some truth in the fleas and cloths spreading the disease? And when was discovered it was actually the rats?
So nobody knew about rats or fleas before the 1890s. So there was this discovery, through the laboratory by Yersinia, who was this French scientist who was in Hong Kong and attempted to investigate and understand what caused the plague. And he identified the bacillus, which was the cause of Yersinia pestis, which caused the plague, which was absorbed by the flea, who then jumped onto a rat, and then the rat died, and then after the rat died, the flea jumped off and onto a human and bit the human. And that was the basic process. So nothing was known about it before. At this period, there was some belief that perhaps dogs spread plague. So, for example, for a lot of plague epidemics in the early modern period, there were decrees about shooting dogs, and you were given a bounty for every dog that you shot. There are vivid once this association is made between flea, bubonic plague, rats, and so on, that sort of the scheme of transmission in the 1890s, then people did take measures. So, for example, when plague broke out in Bombay in the late 1890s and early 1900s, and then moved to Australia, in Sydney, for example, there are photographs at the time in the newspapers of large numbers of rats, hundreds of rats all having been killed, with the proud people in front of them having killed them, and they were also given bounties. But nothing was known before at the time. Medical historians have said, oh, well, why weren't rats mentioned in the literature? Why weren't they shown in pictures at the time? It's because the association wasn't made. So it's only once the laboratory discovery had been made, then they could make that association.
And so whether they made that connection or not, in some ways they must have recognized that there were health benefits to keeping animals they didn't want to keep before.
Yeah, I wonder if sanitation surveys that ever noticed rats.
The ones I've looked at don't mention rats, I'm sorry. I'm afraid the fleas weren't mentioned, because the idea was, you see, that plague was caused by corrupt air. And there's this famous mid-16th century humanist medic called Girolamo Fracastoro, who wrote a treatise called De Contagione, which was about essentially what contagion was. And it was his idea that essentially what happened was that there were so-called seeds of disease in the atmosphere, which contained the disease of plague or other types of disease, which were blown around by the wind. And they arrived in a city over a city. You get representations, of course, of arrows in the earlier period, which represent the corrupt air. And they would fall down onto the city and people would absorb them. Of course, then there's the problem of trying to work out why, if you had this corrupt vapor which fell down on the city and everybody absorbed it, why did not everybody die? So you then bring in the sort of Galenic idea of people's predisposition to disease or not, or their humoral makeup, which made them more likely to get disease or not. So if your neighbour died, but I didn't die, it's because basically in better health. So I've been taking vitamin C on a regular basis or whatever. I'm supposed to echinacea or whatever. Because the textiles were considered as actually absorbing the seeds of disease. So these seeds of disease, which actually goes back to sort of Lucretian idea, but these seeds of disease have a sort of sticky element to them, and they would stick to your clothes. But they were also sticky so they could stick to the walls. And so you've got, there's this famous description in Manzoni and other people of these untori, who spread plague around the city deliberately in order to try and kill people, because those seeds of disease being sticky, they could stick them onto people, onto walls, onto furniture, or whatever it might be. But so plague, from the time of the Black Death, cloth was seen as being one of the ways that plague was transmitted. So, for example, one of the earliest sets of regulations we've got about plague during the Black Death was those in Pistoia, and there was enormous emphasis in that about not allowing any cloth to be imported, textile industry to be stopped completely, and any cloth that had come into contact with infected people would therefore be burnt or sort of fumigated. So that was the role of cloth and textile.
And leather goods, were these considered as part of the problem?
Leather not, because if we go back to my gentleman, so if we go back to my friend, the plague doctor, he actually is wearing this costume in order to keep plague away from him, stop being ill. So he's actually covered completely in leather. So leather is regarded as not being able to absorb any sort of these infectious seeds of disease. So he's obviously got a red leather coat, and he's got leather shoes, long boots, and leather gloves, and also he's got leather covering, must have been rather hot, to his head, and this funny little hat on top. And then obviously, as you know, this enormous beak which contained herbs in order to purify the air he's breathing. So leather was regarded as fine, fur not, but cloth and furs were certainly burnt whenever they could be, or certainly fumigated.
This is so fascinating. We should probably conclude, especially because there's a reception awaiting us outside. So let's just thank John once more. A fascinating talk.
Thank you.